You say in your testimony, PSYOP tactics being used by the U.S. and U.K. military against the American people. That is really scary stuff, reading that. Could you elaborate? Because I think the American people need to hear, they need to hear about this.
Yeah, we now know what happened, which is that basically after the war on terror, the United States used counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, counterpopulism tactics first in the Middle East as part of the Arab Spring uprisings, then in the Eastern Europe as part of the color revolutions, using social media to foment revolutions against places that we wanted regime change, and then using censorship in places to repress conflicting opinion in places that we were trying to stabilize. Those tactics were then turned against the American people after the populist revolutions of 2016. First, you saw Russiagate, this wild conspiracy theory that President Trump was somehow controlled through a sex blackmail operation by the Russians. But then we also saw a very elaborate effort to do exactly what they had done abroad, creating small committees of experts to decide what the truth was and demand censorship on the basis of it. But I also mentioned there's also these proactive influence operations, the most dramatic of which is the Hunter Biden laptop, severely illegal, but we also saw the mobilization of the intelligence community. And now in the latest article that we published today, we have documented that the Agency for International Development has overseen basically a takeover over the last decade and a half of independent investigative journalism in Europe and around the world through OCCRP and supposedly independent journalism organizations with an eye to basically controlling the information and controlling the major news media that do investigative journalism.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for the work that you have done over the last couple Congresses on this issue.
Mr. Shellenberger, can you explain how you traced USAID funding that served as the basis for whistleblower report in 2019, which led to the impeachment of President Trump?
Sure. Well, you may remember that the so-called whistleblower who was in the White House was actually a CIA analyst. And in that whistleblower's complaint, which led to the impeachment, one of the central pieces of evidence was created by a USAID-funded and controlled organization called the OCCRP. And we have another piece out today about how it participated in the Russiagate hoax as well, creating essentially very important information leading to that. So, you have in USAID a much larger fund of money and a much broader strategy for information control that included censorship, but also, as I mentioned, taking control of investigative journalism really worldwide. Its ambitions were, amazing. So, yeah, that's an agency. When we saw that get shut down by DOJ, I thought that was completely appropriate. If there's something in there that it was doing that's valuable, then you could refund it later. But my view, same thing with CISA, death penalty for organizations that participated in violations of the First Amendment like CISA. Cybersecurity is an extremely important function. It shouldn't be contaminated and undermined by censorship activities.
Well, I think it's always been known that our government has funded the change in administrations, if we can say it politely, of other governments. But isn't it borderline treason when the taxpayer when organizations entrusted with protecting our country are now undermining our own government?
Absolutely. If you're trying to do regime change, illegal, if you're weaponizing DHS, FBI, CISA, that's treasonous regime change activities redirected, that you developed abroad, that we developed abroad for regime change, directed against the American people and our representatives. It's shocking, and we still haven't dealt with it as a country.
Mr. Shellenberger, you mentioned that USAID, which has been in the news of late, spending taxpayer money on all kinds of stupid things, is also involved in the censorship effort. And I want you to just elaborate on that a little bit, because this is going on as we speak. I want you to elaborate on that for the committee, if you would.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that USAID viewed this very holistically. And it's important, if you look at the Hunter Biden laptop case, which is an extremely important case to understand, because the FBI was weaponized, then it weaponized the Aspen Institute to brainwash the entire media. It wasn't just that they censored it. It was that they changed the perception of the laptop. They created the perception that it was something other than what it obviously was. And that's what these guys are trying to do. These are called information operations, and USAID has been in the process of taking over so-called independent investigative journalism around the world, and at the same time then training NGOs how to demand censorship. For example, Mr. Aaron's organization has been working to train organizations to so-called flag misinformation behind the scenes. By the way, it's one thing to criticize somebody publicly, which we should all be engaged in.
Yeah.
But this thing where you're skulking around
We do that all the
and
time.
secretly, yeah, that's what open democracy is. This thing of going out and like secretly flagging information behind the scenes and demanding censorship, that's completely an abomination. That is not what
I just
our
want to be clear.
democracy is about.
You're saying USAID, your investigation is now engaged in this pre-bunking kind of concept
Yes.
and process that they did with the laptop story in the fall of 2020.
And it's the exact same approach as well, where often what they're doing, for example, with USAID, OCCRP, is that they're leaking intelligence from the intelligence
Yeah, scary.
agencies and not like WikiLeaks where they just dumped it, I think probably too much without the proper redactions, but they're strategically leaking it and then manipulating places like The Guardian and the New York Times to publish certain stories and control the whole investigative news process.
And we saw this from Yoel Roth's testimony. He testified during these weekly meetings that federal law enforcement communicated to us there was going to be hack and leak operations before the presidential election, likely in October. We had these, so that what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and then they said here who it's going to involve, that there were rumors that the hack and leak operation would involve Hunter Biden. So they set them all up. And then
Burisma.
Shazam, they set them all up because they had the laptop and they knew what was coming. And when it happens, everyone buys into what the 51 former intel officials say.